My name is R. Crosby Lyles, and this is News from the Can. Experimental results can often be counterintuitive. This is why it's important not to jump to conclusions and to consult with as many divergent educated opinions as possible before making a decision. Anyone who might be disturbed by unfiltered climate data should take heart that no one really knows for sure how climate change is going to play out. Our stated opinions here are not facts. The following data and images should be checked against other sources. All are encouraged to leave comments that may direct others to alternative sources and to alert us to any and all possible errors you feel may exist in this video. Once introduced to the concept of doomsday warming, I found it essential to study global warming to find out for myself if human extinction really was possible due to planet-wide cascade failure of the environment caused by CO2 emissions. I found that mass extinctions like the Permian-Triassic had causes far beyond what humans may even be capable of. There were large additions of acid-producing sulfur compounds from volcanic activity along with massive rapid injections of carbon dioxide and methane that precipitated the Great Dying and other extinction events. Today, humans produce a trickle of carbon dioxide and acid rain in comparison. Nevertheless, many theories about how it might be possible to get to a cascade failure like the Permian-Triassic have cropped up over the years, which ultimately involve eutrophication and anoxification of the world's oceans. However, the proposed mechanisms are never really clearly stated, leaving the obvious questions: where exactly does the CO2 accumulate, and what are the precise mechanics of how it will fry the planet? We've produced videos suggesting sulfuric acid zero as the culprit and CO2 as being as much a symptom as a cause of doomsday warming specifically. This is because an acidic ocean is not able to sequester nearly as much carbon dioxide, so it can release as much as 50 times the amount that is in the atmosphere now. It is my belief that the rate of acidification from anthropogenic CO2 alone is not enough to cause a cascade failure. In order to get to a minimum possible pH of 5.6, the air would have to be completely saturated with CO2, in which case every living thing on planet Earth would be dead anyway. This has never happened in the most extreme cases like the Permian-Triassic extinction, and 30% of terrestrial life survived then. In the case of advanced acidification from multiple lower pH sources, CO2 could persist above the oceans in greater quantity, allowing uninhabitable heat to take hold at the surface. This might be considered a final stage, but is not the primary mechanism the PhDs who really know what they are saying are talking about. The cause appears to be simple to explain and easy to see why there is both alarm and skepticism. And thankfully, we don't need proxy data of temperature and CO2 levels over the entire history of the Earth to know whether carbon release follows temperature or vice versa or any of that other stuff. So here it is. By chance, I stumbled upon the most cogent explanation of the actual mechanics of global warming from a global warming skeptic. Richard Lenzen, Ph.D., from Wikipedia, quote, attended the Bronx High School of Science, winning Regents and National Merit Scholarships, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and Harvard University. From Harvard, he received an A.B. in physics in 1960, followed by an S.M. in applied mathematics in 1961 and a Ph.D. in applied mathematics in 1964. His doctoral thesis, Radiative and Photochemical Processes in Strato and Mesospheric Dynamics, treated the interactions of ozone photochemistry, radiative transfer, and dynamics in the middle atmosphere, end quote. End quote. He was a lead author of Chapter 7, Physical Climate Processes and Feedbacks of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's Third Assessment Report on Climate Change. He has criticized the scientific consensus about climate change and what he has called climate alarmism. So indeed, he is a vocal skeptic of global warming hysteria. But when it comes to anything you ever wanted to know about climate issues and more, he is without question the man. The link to his talk about the proposed mechanism of global warming and mitigating feedbacks is in the description. Here is a summary. The Earth has something very similar to the central air conditioner you might have in your home, which uses an evaporator to remove heat from the interior and a condenser to expel that heat to the outside. Heat from the sun is either reflected by clouds or penetrates to the surface. At the surface, the heat absorbed by water is given off in the endothermic process of evaporation and subsequent expansion of the water vapor-laden air, causing convection. Convection not only dissipates energy through fluid friction forces and by doing work to loft warm, humid air higher in the atmosphere, but also allows the exothermic process of condensation to release this heat as cloud droplets form in the colder, lower pressure environment above. So heat is largely carried away from the surface by the change in phase of water and convection. From there, this heat can radiate out to space from the cloud tops. The formation of clouds can also produce a negative feedback on surface warming by reflecting solar irradiance back out to space. So even though H2O is the principal greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, the formation of clouds under normal circumstances places an upper limit on how much the surface can warm. The amount of warming is a function of the operating temperature of our planet's onboard AC unit. Dr. Lenzen went on to suggest that high cirrus clouds could reflect enough energy back towards the surface, preventing cloud tops from expelling heat. The subsequent buildup of energy would raise the temperature of the entire system. It's like throwing a blanket on the condenser of your air conditioner. Heat is removed less efficiently, so the temperature of the entire system goes up, producing a hotter house. My first thought upon hearing about the details of this paradigm was that the proposed thermostat effect of carbon dioxide on the climate may come from the persistence of CO2 in the stratosphere. Carbon dioxide is quite soluble in water. In fact, it is thought that CO2 aids in the coalescence of water vapor into cloud droplets as it rises in the troposphere and basically washes out in the rain. On the other hand, the stratosphere is very dry and diffuse, allowing CO2 to persist there longer, becoming more and more spread out. Remember that heat-trapping cirrus clouds are ice crystals, not liquid water, so they can coexist quite well with CO2. Carbon dioxide is also chemically stable here, so why wouldn't it form a greenhouse blanket over the cloud tops along with cirrus clouds, allowing the energy to build up and raise the temperature of the entire system? Dr. Lenzen was very specific about cirrus clouds, not CO2. However, you can see the concentration and distribution of CO2 quite clearly in the stratosphere from the Copernicus satellite's instruments. The following may be news to some people, provided the data is accurate and we are reading the legend correctly. Today, the Copernicus satellite shows CO2 concentrations maxing out at perhaps as much as 1,000 parts per million at the 50 hectopascal level, which varies widely between the equator and the poles, but probably has a mean elevation around 20,000 kilometers or 60,000 feet. This thick band of CO2 is the densest around the equator. With relatively low reactivity, this CO2 will persist and build. Isotopic data from the tracking of carbon-13 in the years after the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty pegged the half-life of CO2 at 2.7 years in the atmosphere. This figure is from an 80s vintage edition of Chemistry of Atmospheres by Richard P. Wayne, Oxford Press, well before the pie fight over climate change got underway. If you want to see mayhem, search for the half-life of CO2 in the atmosphere on Wikipedia. Nevertheless, air in the stratosphere moves in one cell in something called Brewer Dobson Circulation from the equator towards the poles. It's weird. There is only horizontal mixing. Winds can reach 60 meters per second or 130 miles per hour. It's heavily affected by gravity waves, and there is no convection or vertical mixing. This is why it's called the stratosphere, because it is heavily stratified. The air moves briskly towards the poles, towards something called the surf zone, where mixing becomes more pronounced and wavier. How did the CO2 get up there? The multitude of man-made fires burning in equatorial regions could be a contributor, but another significant pathway is methane released from various sources around the world, not limited to the Arctic. Most emissions of methane gas come from the rice fields in India and China, but China is the king daddy of emitters of every type of air pollution out there. Having said that, last February we captured what appears to be a large release of methane gas from northeastern Europe and Russia. We tracked the plume to the 50 hectopascal level, where you can clearly see methane breaking down into CO2 and water, though we did not collect water vapor data at that time. The 50 hectopascal level of CO2 was also much lower then than it is now, and it was the dead of winter. This leads me to believe that the observed methane plume probably came from human activity and could be a contributor to the higher level of CO2 we see now in the stratosphere. Looking at the total column of CO2, however, the emission patterns seem to be pretty clearly from the usual suspects. We will step through from the surface to the 50 hectopascal level so you can decide for yourself. How long will this concentration of CO2 stay in a wide band around the equator at the 50 hectopascal level? We haven't been able to assess historic data yet because I have to work for a living, so some of you out there can probably answer that better than me. Needless to say, experts should be consulted. Let me reiterate that Dr. Lenson emphasized cirrus clouds over CO2, and he was a contributor to the IPCC's third assessment report. Dr. Richard P. Wayne wrote that greenhouse gas in the stratosphere caused global cooling back in the 80s in his book, Chemistry of Atmospheres, so it is crucial not to jump to conclusions. Looking at concentrations of other gases, two things of interest emerge. Sulfur dioxide levels are non-existent at the 50 hectopascal level, and methane is measured in parts per billion and virtually non-existent over Antarctica. I'm not sure what aerosol shading some people are talking about that is supposedly moderating temperature, but it's not clear to me from the instruments. Clearly, if CO2 were going to fry us at that level, the equator would be toast by now. If climatereanalyzer.org is to be believed, anomalous temperature has indeed risen here and there over the years. But as I've said before, the equator's temperatures have remained pretty much nominal, and July temperatures over the North Pole have been a single year since 1979. It is also clear that sea surface temperatures and 2-meter temperature anomaly are now below average in many places around the world besides the equator. Upwelling and decadal oscillations in sea surface temperatures could certainly be the cause of these lower temperatures, as well as drought across Australia and parts of Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. But the question remains, how is this accumulation affecting the climate? Will it affect decadal oscillation and other oscillations? Ongoing polar amplification in the face of this CO2 accumulation in the stratosphere may be the reason for Dr. Lenz's emphasis on cirrus clouds. Because cirrus clouds are known to trap heat, elevating temperature up to 10 degrees C below them. The question then becomes, how do cirrus clouds produce polar amplification when they can be most commonly found around the equator? Frankly, it's hard to see the correlation between warmer surface temps around the equator and this high concentration of CO2. The effect of heating or cooling may simply come down to proximity. The blanket is closer to the ground in polar regions, so less heat can escape there than at the equator. Some climatologists say that it takes a while, maybe decades, for the planet to warm up once we have adjusted the thermostat. This time delay is supposedly from heat stored in the oceans as if they were a giant capacitor. However, anomalous temperature readings today, October 10, 2019, show a lot of anomalously cool temperatures around the globe in places we might expect to be warming. The geologic record from proxy data shows the glacial periods often follow a sharp spike in global temperatures. Many climatologists think that because of the heat capacity of the oceans, fast turnarounds in the climate must be caused by some change in the atmosphere. My contention has been for some time that the accumulation of greenhouse gas or crystals in the stratosphere ultimately causes turnaround that leads to a colder planet. Which feedbacks take hold seem to be anyone's guess at this point. It cannot be stressed enough that these systems are enormously complicated, and not many people, if any, fully understand the complexity. In any case, one look at the 50 hectopascal CO2 level tells us we will find out soon enough. Links are in the description. My name is R. Crosby Lyles, and this has been News from the Can. There is nothing to fear but fear itself. Remember that it never hurts to be prepared with extra provisions, water, batteries, alternative communication devices, and more. We don't really know what is going to happen next, or for how long, so it's always best to stay informed. Do your own research and decide for yourself. If you like this content, drop us a like, subscribe, and share. Love you guys. Thanks for all your support. Thanks for watching.